There's a story that spread all over the internet about the Smithsonian institution. It says a Supreme Court ruling in 2014 forced the Smithsonian to admit they destroyed thousands of giant human skeletons to protect the mainstream narrative of human evolution. It says there's classified paperwork and whistleblowers that came forward. That specific story is fake. It originated on a satire website in 2014 and spread from there. There was no Supreme Court case, no classified documents, and no whistleblowers, and the organization cited in the story doesn't even exist. It was invented. The fake story is so widespread that anyone who brings up real questions about the Smithsonian and giant skeletons gets lumped in and dismissed. You mention the Smithsonian and the giant bones, and someone immediately throws the Supreme Court story at you and the conversation's over. So I want to set that story aside and look at what's actually documented, because there's a real issue that fake story has been burying for years. In the late 1800s, the Smithsonian launched something called the Bureau of American Ethnology under the direction of a man named John Wesley Powell. They created what they call the Mound Exploration Division, and its stated mission was to survey and excavate the tens of thousands of ancient earthworks scattered across the eastern United States. They set up a system of local excavators, farmers, construction workers, and anyone who found something unusual in a mound was encouraged to send whatever they found to Washington for study. The Smithsonian actively built a one-way pipeline from small towns all over America directly into their vaults. So let me read you how this all played out. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the New York Times, the London Globe, and Scientific America all published articles reporting the discovery of giant human skeletons. In multiple cases noting the remains were sent to the Smithsonian for further study. No record of their display or analysis ever surfaced publicly. The New York Times and Scientific American both published reports on these finds at the same time, both noting where the remains went. And those aren't just isolated cases. Researchers looking back at newspaper archives from the late 1800s into the early 1900s have documented hundreds of reports. Independent towns separated by hundreds of miles, reporting similar finds using similar descriptions. In 1883, the Smithsonian dispatched archaeologists to conduct extensive excavations of burial mounds in West Virginia. It's in the Smithsonian's own published record. The lead archaeologist was a man named Cyrus Thomas, and he wrote everything his teams found in a report the Smithsonian published in 1894 as part of the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology. Now I'm going to read an excerpt of what that report describes. In the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia, Thomas's team excavated the Cryo Mound. Inside, they found 13 skeletons. A central skeleton was described as once powerful man, a very large size. Surrounding him were 10 other skeletons arranged in a spoke-like pattern. The central burial was accompanied by a fish dart, a lance head, and a sheet of hammered native copper near the head. The description of very large size is in the Smithsonian's own published report, written by their own field archaeologists, about finds their own teams made on official government-funded excavations. And then those bones went to Washington, and that's where the trail gets cold. What makes the West Virginia case worth paying attention to is that it's not isolated, it's one of hundreds. Jim Vieira spent years collecting newspaper accounts from the 1800s to the early 1900s. He ended up with over 1,000 documented reports of anomalous skeletal finds, most of them describing remains between 7 and 9 feet tall. Most were found in burial grounds, and many of them were reported as being sent to the Smithsonian. Now I'm going to go through a few specific cases on this that were in the report. 1885 in Ohio, near the Serpent Mound Complex. 7 skeletons over 7 feet tall uncovered from burial mounds. Reported in the St. Louis Dispatch. Artifacts and bones sent to the Smithsonian, and no record of display or analysis ever surfaced. In 1891, Clear River, Idaho. A skeleton with a double row of teeth found buried near the riverbank. The remains were turned over to researchers and then later disappeared, and that site remains unmarked today. The 1920s in Catalina Island, California, a burial complex containing over 4,000 skeletons excavated by a researcher named Ralph Glidden. Smithsonian officials reportedly visited his collection before it was dismantled, and the bones have not been publicly located since. The double teeth detail shows up in multiple cases across different states, with people that have no affiliation with each other, in different parts of the country, all describing the same unusual physical characteristic. You can say these were all misidentifications, that the sizes were exaggerated, that record keeping was poor, and all of those would be fair. But what we can't fully explain is why so many trails end at the same institution. Now, what was happening in the academia in the late 1800s? At the time, there was no massive ongoing debate about who built the mounds. The popular theory, pushed hard by certain political and academic interests, was that Native Americans couldn't have built them. that they were too sophisticated and that they must have been built by a lost race, sometimes described as giants, sometimes as a vanished white civilization. Now that sounds fairly offensive now because it kinda is. It was a way for them to justify manifest destiny. If a superior vanished race built these structures, not the ancestors of the people being displaced, that made the displacement easier to rationalize. John Wesley Powell, the man who ran the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, was deeply committed to a specific agenda. He wanted to demonstrate that Native Americans had built the mounds, which was actually the correct conclusion. The mounds were built by indigenous peoples. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report proved that. The problem is what may have happened alongside that. Here's another excerpt I want to read to you. The suppression of giant skeleton evidence may have been a byproduct of that agenda. Richard Dewhurst, an Emmy Award-winning writer who worked for HBO, PBS, and ABC News, and the History Channel, spent years examining this and concluded that the suppression began shortly after the Civil War and intensified in 1879 when Powell was appointed the Smithsonian director, launching what Dewhurst called a strict pro-evolution, pro-manifest destiny agenda. In aggressively pushing one correct conclusion that the Native Americans built the mounds, the institution may have simultaneously suppressed findings that complicated their narrative, and anything anomalous threatened the clean story that they were trying to push. Institutional narratives have a way of deciding what evidence gets to exist. The Vatican's another good example of that. In 1990, the United States Congress passed a law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the NAGPRA. It required federal institutions and federally funded museums to return Native American remains and cultural objects to their affiliated tribes. This was a human rights victory. The way the government has been treating Native American remains for a century was indefensible, and the law was long overdue. And here's a few more details on that. In 1989, as part of the legislation creating the National Museum of the American Indian, Congress required the Smithsonian Institution to begin identifying and inventorying its holdings. At the time, the Smithsonian had a massive Native American artifact collection and 17,000 skeletal remains. Since 1990, the Smithsonian repatriated over 6,000 human remains and informed tribes of others. But here's the interesting part. As of recent reporting, over 117,000 Native American individuals are still in museum and federal agency collections across the United States. 94% of those have not been culturally affiliated with any present-day tribe, meaning they can't be returned because nobody can establish who they belong to. A 2023 investigation by ProPublica and NBC News found that there are 104,539 Native American ancestors held by 617 institutions, with many institutions actively resisting return despite legal requirements. The system created to correct an injustice has also, whether by design or by consequence, made it nearly impossible to go back and study what was actually collected in those 19th century expeditions. Remains that were repatriated and reburied are permanently beyond the reach of any further analysis. If there were anomalous finds in those collections, they're gone now, not through malice necessarily, but through a system that, as one researcher put it, is perfect machine for making inconvenient evidence disappear. And you can't talk about giant skeleton bone reports without addressing where that idea comes from at a deeper level. The Book of Enoch, which we talked about on this channel, describes the Watchers crossing into human reality and producing offspring described as giants. The Hebrew word Nephilim appears in Genesis and Numbers, and most translations render it to giants. Genesis 6:4 reads, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown." The Nephilim appear again in Numbers 13 when Israelite spies return from Canaan and report seeing beings so large that they felt like grasshoppers by comparison. What's interesting from a research standpoint isn't whether you take those texts literally, it's that the description of a previous race of anomalous large humans appears across completely unconnected ancient traditions. The Paiutes of Nevada have oral traditions describing a race of red-haired giants called the Siteka, who they drove into a cave and burned. When Lovelock Cave in Nevada was excavated in 1912, researchers found mummified remains with reddish hair. Some were described as significantly larger than average. Those remains were sent to the University of California, and then to the Smithsonian, and now their location is unclear. Now, I know we all want there to be giants. I mean, giants is one of the most fascinating topics on the planet. As a kid, I loved giants. But what does the evidence support, and what doesn't it support? As far as we know, there are no giant skeleton remains sitting in a lab somewhere that archaeologists are hiding, and that Supreme Court story is fabricated. The most viral version of this is invented. But what is documented is this. The Smithsonian's own 1894 field reports describe anomalous large skeletal finds in their own excavations. Hundreds of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, published in the New York Times, Scientific American, and local papers across the country, describe familiar finds being sent to the Smithsonian. No physical remains matching these descriptions are currently on public display or in public accessible collections. The system that would have allowed independent verification, physical examination of the remains themselves, no longer exists. Repatriation and reburial under NAG-PRA has made the retroactive study impossible. So the honest question isn't whether giants existed in the way mythology describes them. The honest question is whether there are populations of anomalous large humans in pre-Columbian North America. Whether the Smithsonian collected evidence of that during its 19th century mound explorations, and whether institutional pressures at the time resulted in that evidence being suppressed, misled, or lost. And those questions can't be answered now. The evidence that could have answered them is gone, reburied, misfiled, or lost in a system that was, as the evidence shows, never designed to preserve anomalous finds. And that fake Supreme Court story, the one that spread across the internet and that everyone immediately associates with the topic, made sure that anyone asking any real questions about the Smithsonian gets dismissed before the conversation even starts. Whether that was by coincidence or by design is something that I'll let you decide. Do you think they're hiding something from us? It's more likely that they are than they're not. The Vatican is another example where anything that doesn't jive with the narrative seems to get swept under the rug, and all the people who call it out are discredited. There's lots of recent examples of this, like Bob Lazar and Graham Hancock. They're trying to label him as a pseudoscience guy, which I think he makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, what is it about our past that you don't think that they want us to know? And in case you want to go deeper, Richard Dewhurst's book, The Giants That Ruled America, pulls together 400 years of newspaper accounts, historical records, and Smithsonian field reports on this topic. I would love to hear what your thoughts on giants are in general. Do you think they ever existed, or was it just a case of a bunch of tall people? Like, we have tall people with pituitary issues and different things. Was that what this was? And they just didn't have an understanding of what was going on back then? That's probably what it was, to be honest with you. And also, do you think these institutions are hiding stuff from us because they don't think we can handle it or take the truth? And I think that's extremely arrogant of them because none of them are any smarter than any of us are. They've proven that over and over again. As always, thank you so much for your time. If you haven't done so, please subscribe, like, and drop that comment on this video. I really do appreciate you watching. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.